February 1943. Stalingrad is finished. Not concluded. Not resolved. Finished. An entire German army has ceased to exist. For years, German generals had accepted losses. They had accepted setbacks. They had even accepted temporary defeat. But this is different. Inside German headquarters, there are no speeches, no dramatic reactions, no rage-filled orders. What follows Stalingrad is something far more dangerous. Silence. Maps are updated. Red lines move west. Blue lines shrink. Symbols that once represented entire divisions disappear. No one argues with the maps, because the maps are no longer debatable. For the first time since the war began, German generals are not asking how to win. They are asking something else. What is still possible? And even that question feels heavy. Stalingrad is not just a military defeat. It is a psychological break. Until now, every disaster had an explanation. A bad winter, a delayed supply line, an unexpected resistance. This time, none of those explanations work. The enemy did not collapse. The counterattack did not fail. The encirclement did not break. Everything that was supposed to happen happened to Germany instead. Senior officers begin running calculations they had avoided before. Not optimistic ones. Not hopeful ones. Honest ones. How many trained officers were lost? How long will replacements take? How much equipment is gone permanently? How many fronts can still be sustained? These questions lead to answers no one wants to voice. Because when the numbers are combined, a realization forms. Quietly. Slowly. Relentlessly. The war cannot be won the way it was planned. This does not mean Germany will lose tomorrow. It does not mean Berlin is threatened. But it does mean something critical has vanished. The margin for recovery. Before Stalingrad, defeat could be reversed. After Stalingrad, defeat compounds. Losses stack. Experience drains. Time accelerates in the wrong direction. The generals understand this immediately. They do not need speeches. They only need to look at the Eastern Front, and then at the industrial reports. For the first time, German generals see the war as two separate realities. What is happening on the battlefield? What is happening behind the battlefield? And both are pointing in the same direction. What makes this moment so important is not what is said. It is what is no longer said. There is no talk of decisive victory. No talk of ending the war quickly. No talk of forcing peace. Those phrases quietly disappear from planning rooms. In their place appear new words. Stabilize. Hold. Delay. Buy time. These are not words used by a winning army. The generals do not announce defeat. They do not revolt. They do not resign en masse. They do something far more human. They adjust their expectations. And that adjustment marks the true turning point of the war, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the men responsible for fighting it. Because once generals stop believing in victory, every order that follows carries a different meaning. Maps do not lie. They can be misread. They can be framed optimistically. They can be explained away, for a time. But eventually, maps tell a story that words cannot hide. After Stalingrad, German generals spend hours standing over tables covered in paper, not debating tactics, not planning bold maneuvers. Counting. They count divisions that no longer exist. They count gaps that cannot be filled. They count distances that are growing instead of shrinking. The Eastern Front, once a sweeping arc of advance, now looks brittle. Too long. Too thin. Too exposed. Every map shows the same problem. Germany is holding too much territory with too few forces. This had always been risky. But now it is catastrophic. Before 1943, space had been an asset. Territory meant resources. Depth meant flexibility. Control meant options. Now, space is a liability. Every kilometer of front line demands men, fuel, ammunition, and transport. and those resources are no longer available in the quantities required. Generals begin to notice patterns that were once dismissed. Counterattacks that regain ground, but cannot be sustained. Defensive lines that hold until reserves run out. Victories that create new problems instead of solving old ones. The maps reveal something deeply unsettling. Even successful operations are no longer improving Germany's position. They are merely slowing deterioration. Another realization emerges, quietly but unmistakably. The enemy's maps look different. Soviet forces are not shrinking. They are reorganizing, rotating, returning stronger. Western Allied positions are expanding, not retreating. Ports are secured. Airfields multiply. Logistics networks solidify. For the first time, German generals see the war not as a sequence of battles, but as two curves moving in opposite directions. Germany's capacity is declining. The enemy's capacity is increasing, and the gap between them widens every month. This is the moment when planning changes tone. Previously, plans asked, "How do we break the enemy?" Now they ask, "How do we prevent collapse?" Maps that once invited arrows now invite questions. Where can forces be shortened? Which fronts can be abandoned, if any? How much ground can be traded without triggering disaster? These are not aggressive questions. They are defensive, almost desperate. Yet even here, there is restraint. The generals do not yet speak openly of defeat. Not because they don't understand it, but because saying it aloud changes everything. Maps have power. Once defeat is acknowledged on paper, it becomes undeniable in reality. And once that happens, the war enters a phase no one knows how to control. So the generals compromise with truth. They accept it privately while allowing public language to remain unchanged. The maps show contraction. The speeches do not. This creates a dangerous split. Inside planning rooms, realism grows. Outside them, illusion persists. And the gap between the two becomes a source of constant tension. Because every order issued must now serve two purposes. Appear confident. Avoid collapse. Winning is no longer required. Stability is. By mid-1943, German generals no longer ask whether the war can be won. They ask a narrower, darker question. How bad can the ending be? That question does not appear on maps. But it shapes every decision that follows. In the next section, we move away from paper and numbers and into something far more dangerous. The private conversations where generals confront what they cannot officially admit. The most important decisions of this war are not written down. They are whispered. After Stalingrad, German generals begin having conversations that never appear in official records. They happen late at night, in side rooms, on walks away from headquarters. They are careful, measured, and deliberately vague. Because everyone involved understands the danger of clarity. No one says, "The war is lost." That sentence is never spoken directly. Instead, they speak in codes. The situation is becoming increasingly unfavorable. Future operations must be more limited. We should consider preserving forces. These phrases mean the same thing. Everyone in the room understands it. This is how professionals communicate when truth is forbidden. They speak around reality, never through it. Some generals are more honest than others. A few push harder. They argue that fronts must be shortened, that territory must be abandoned, that survival now matters more than prestige. But even these arguments are framed cautiously, not as admissions of defeat, but as temporary adjustments. Because admitting the truth openly carries consequences. Not professional consequences, personal ones. By 1943, German generals are no longer dealing with a purely military authority. They are dealing with a political system that does not tolerate bad news. Those who deliver unpleasant truths are sidelined, ignored or removed. Sometimes quietly, sometimes not. Everyone knows the stories. Commanders relieved for lack of faith, officers accused of defeatism, Careers ended or worse for saying what the maps already show. Fear shapes language. This creates a chilling environment. The more accurate a general's assessment is, the more dangerous it becomes to express. So realism retreats inward. Honesty becomes private. Inside these closed conversations, a consensus begins to form, not about winning, but about managing loss. They discuss how long the front might hold, which regions must be defended for political reasons, how to slow advances without provoking total collapse. These are not discussions of strategy. They are discussions of containment. Some generals hope for external change, a split among enemies, war weariness, political upheaval. They do not believe these outcomes are likely, but they cling to them because they require no action, only time. Others are more fatalistic. They understand that the war's outcome is fixed. What remains uncertain is the cost. And cost, in this system, is measured in lives. Yet even among those who understand the reality most clearly, action is limited. Why? Because there is no safe path from understanding to change. This is the central tragedy of these private conversations. The truth is known, but knowledge alone does not create power. To stop the war would require confronting authority directly, not negotiating, not adjusting plans, but breaking the system that sustains the war itself. And that step lies far beyond military professionalism. So the generals remain trapped. They know the war cannot be won. They know continuing it will destroy what remains. And yet, they continue issuing orders. Not because they are blind, but because the structure they serve leaves no alternative. This is the moment when the German High Command stops functioning as a military institution and becomes a mechanism of continuation. Its purpose is no longer victory. It is maintenance. In the next section, we'll explore why these realizations could never be spoken publicly, and why silence became a form of obedience. By mid-1943, the greatest danger facing German generals is no longer the enemy. It is honesty. In a normal military system, acknowledging reality is a duty. You report losses. You adjust plans. You warn leadership. But this war is no longer normal. And neither is the authority structure above the generals. The problem is not that defeat is unimaginable. It is that admitting defeat is unforgivable. Publicly stating that the war cannot be won is not treated as analysis. It is treated as betrayal. Not disagreement. Not pessimism. Betrayal. The system has evolved to punish bad news. Optimism is rewarded. Silence is tolerated. Realism is dangerous. This creates a perverse incentive. The more accurate a general's assessment, the greater the personal risk in expressing it. Generals understand this instinctively. They have seen colleagues removed for lack of confidence. They have seen careers end after honest briefings. They have seen warnings ignored and remembered. No one needs to be told twice. So language changes. Orders become vague. Reports soften conclusions. Predictions avoid absolutes. Instead of saying, "This front will collapse," they say, "The situation requires careful monitoring." Instead of saying, "We cannot replace these losses," they say, "Future operations must be limited." Truth is hidden inside professional caution. This is not cowardice. It is survival. At this stage of the war, German generals are not free actors. They are functionaries inside a system that equates doubt with disloyalty. And once a system reaches that point, honest communication collapses. Silence becomes safer than speech. Ambiguity becomes protection. And illusion becomes policy. What makes this especially dangerous is that the leadership at the top begins to believe its own filtered reality. Reports arrive already softened. Warnings arrive already diluted. Each layer of command removes a little more truth, until reality barely survives the journey upward. This creates a feedback loop. Leadership demands confidence. Confidence produces distortion. Distortion reinforces denial. And denial drives decisions further away from reality. For the generals, this is a nightmare. They are expected to execute orders they know are futile, while pretending those orders still make sense. To disagree openly is to risk destruction. To comply silently is to guarantee it. So they choose a third option. They comply but quietly adapt. They reinterpret orders. They delay when possible. They minimize exposure, not to win the war but to reduce damage. This quiet adaptation is the last form of resistance available inside the system, and it is fragile, because silence does not stop a war. It only allows it to continue without accountability. In the next section, we'll see how this silence changes the nature of command itself, how strategy slowly gives way to something else, something darker. There is a moment in every lost war when strategy quietly dies, not announced, not acknowledged. It simply stops being relevant. By late 1943, German generals are no longer designing campaigns to defeat the enemy. They are managing decline. Earlier in the war, planning had been expansive. Objectives were clear. Timelines were aggressive. Risk was acceptable, even encouraged. Now, planning meetings feel different. Shorter. More cautious. Focused on preventing catastrophe rather than achieving success. The language tells the story. Words like breakthrough disappear. They are replaced by containment, stabilization, orderly withdrawal. These are not the terms of a victorious army. They are the vocabulary of survival. Generals begin asking questions that would have been unthinkable before. Which units can be sacrificed to save others? Which regions can be abandoned with the least political fallout? How much destruction can be absorbed before the system breaks? These are not moral questions. They are triage. Every decision now involves loss. There are no good options, only less disastrous ones. Offensives are no longer planned to change the course of the war. They are planned to interrupt the enemy, to slow advances, to force pauses, to buy days, weeks, sometimes months. Time becomes the only remaining resource. Even successful operations feel hollow. Ground is regained, then lost again. Enemy units are damaged, then replaced. Momentum never returns. The generals know this. They can see the pattern repeating. And yet, they continue planning. Not because they believe in victory, but because planning is what keeps the system functioning. If planning stops, the war stops. And stopping is not permitted. This is the moment when German high command fully transforms. It no longer exists to win the war. It exists to manage its collapse without triggering panic. That responsibility weighs heavily, because managing collapse requires sacrificing clarity. You cannot tell soldiers they are fighting for delay. You cannot tell civilians the outcome is fixed. You cannot tell the nation the truth. You must maintain the appearance of purpose. So strategy becomes performance. Plans are written to look decisive. Orders are framed to sound confident. Operations are justified with language that hides their real intent. The war continues, not because it makes sense, but because the structure demands motion. For many generals, this is the most corrosive phase. They are no longer commanders shaping events. They are administrators of destruction. And they know it. This is where hope changes shape. It is no longer hope for victory. It is hope that the damage can be limited, that something, anything, can be preserved. In the next section, we'll examine the precise moment when even this limited hope begins to fade. When delaying the end is no longer about strategy, but about obedience. There is a subtle but decisive shift that happens inside a losing command. It is not marked by a defeat, not by a collapse, not even by despair. It is marked by resignation. By early 1944, most senior German generals no longer expect events to turn in their favor. They do not say this aloud. They do not write it down. But their behavior changes. Earlier, plans had contained contingencies. If this fails, then that. If the enemy advances, counter here. If losses mount, regroup there. Now, contingencies disappear. Plans assume loss. They are written not to prevent defeat, but to shape its timing. Hope, in its original sense, is gone. What replaces it is something thinner. Delay. Delay is not optimism. It does not imagine a better future. It only imagines a later one. Operations are justified with phrases like buying time, maintaining cohesion, preserving order. These words sound technical, but they are emotional compromises. They allow generals to continue acting without admitting that the outcome is fixed. This is where morale quietly changes. Not among soldiers, but among those issuing the orders. When hope exists, even faintly, sacrifice feels purposeful. When hope disappears, sacrifice becomes transactional. Lives are spent not to win, but to postpone collapse. Generals begin measuring success differently. A front that holds for a week is a success. A retreat that avoids encirclement is a success. A unit that survives long enough to withdraw is a success. Victory is no longer the standard. Survival is. This redefinition is never announced. It is simply adopted. And once adopted, it reshapes everything. Orders become more rigid, not because leaders are confident, but because rigidity delays reckoning. A flexible system adapts. An inflexible system resists. Even when resistance is futile. For many generals, this phase is the most psychologically exhausting. They are no longer fighting an enemy. They are fighting time. And time always wins. Every delay carries a cost. Each postponed decision means more destruction, more casualties, more suffering. But delay also provides comfort. It keeps the present intact. And the present, however terrible, feels safer than an unknown future. This is how wars continue past reason, not through fanaticism alone, but through incremental postponement. One day at a time, one order at a time, one silence at a time. By the middle of 1944, the generals understand something with painful clarity. They are no longer steering the war. They are being carried by it. In the next section, we will look at the force that made this resignation unavoidable. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of disobedience. By mid-1944, German generals are no longer divided by strategy. They are divided by obedience. On one side is reality. The fronts are collapsing. Air superiority is gone. Reserves are exhausted. Industry is under constant attack. Every professional assessment points in the same direction. The war cannot be stabilized. On the other side is authority. Orders continue to arrive with absolute language. Hold. Counterattack. No retreat. Victory is still possible. These commands are not requests. They are tests of loyalty. Inside the high command, this creates a moral fracture. Not between brave and cowardly, but between honest and compliant. Some generals still try to adapt quietly. They reinterpret orders. They delay offensives. They withdraw under the guise of local adjustments. These actions are not rebellion. They are attempts to save lives within a system that no longer allows rational command. Others choose strict obedience. Not because they believe the orders make sense, but because disobedience feels more dangerous than defeat. In this environment, refusing an order does not just end a career. It can end a life. This is the crucial distinction most histories overlook. German generals did not keep fighting because they were blind. They kept fighting because the cost of acknowledging reality was immediate and personal. Reality threatened the future. Disobedience threatened the present. As the situation worsens, pressure increases. Failures are punished more harshly. Doubt is equated with disloyalty. Success is redefined as effort, not outcome. If a unit is destroyed while following orders, that is acceptable. If it survives by disobeying, that is unforgivable. This inversion destroys professional command. Decisions are no longer judged by results. They are judged by compliance. For the high command, this creates paralysis. Everyone knows what should be done. No one can safely say it. and fewer still can act on it openly. Meetings become performances. Optimistic language replaces honest analysis. Maps are presented without context. Losses are framed as temporary. The war becomes a theatre of reassurance. And in that theatre, obedience is the only role allowed. This is how reality is silenced without being defeated. Not by force, but by fear. By late 1944, the High Command is no longer a place where strategy is debated. It is a place where instructions are passed downward and responsibility is pushed outward. No one wants to be the person who admits the war is over, because that admission would not end the war. It would only end their protection. In the next section, we'll look at what happened when some generals tried to warn anyway. When realism briefly surfaced and was ignored, every collapsing system produces warnings. Not dramatic ones. Not speeches. Quiet ones. By late 1944, some German generals still try, carefully, to push reality upward. They submit reports emphasizing shortages. They outline risks that cannot be mitigated. They recommend withdrawals that would shorten fronts and preserve forces. These warnings are not emotional. They are professional. And that is precisely why they fail. Because by this stage of the war, professionalism itself has become suspect. Warnings are not evaluated on accuracy. They are evaluated on tone. Does the report sound confident? Does it affirm belief? Does it align with expectations? If not, it is dismissed. Some warnings are softened before they are delivered. Others are rewritten. Some never move past intermediate command levels. Reality is filtered, not out of malice, but out of fear. When warnings do reach the top, the response is predictable. They are framed as pessimism, as lack of faith, as misunderstanding of the bigger picture. That bigger picture, however, exists only in speeches, not in logistics, not in manpower, not in production. This is the final failure of command, not ignorance, ejection. At this point, the system no longer needs to silence dissent aggressively. It simply ignores it. And ignoring reality is often more effective than punishing it. For the generals who still try to warn, the consequences are subtle but decisive. They are excluded from planning. Their influence fades. Their recommendations are sidelined. They remain in uniform, but no longer shape outcomes. Others watch this happen and learn. They stop warning. They stop arguing. They stop trying. Not because they believe the situation has improved, but because they understand the rules have changed. The war does not continue because no one knows the truth. It continues because the truth no longer has authority. By early 1945, warnings are meaningless. Everyone understands what will happen. No one can prevent it. This is when preparation quietly shifts. Not preparation for victory. Preparation for aftermath. In the next section, we'll see how some generals begin preparing for defeat. Not openly, but cautiously and privately. By early 1945, something subtle changes inside the German High Command. Not in public orders, not in speeches, not in propaganda, but in behavior. Some generals stop planning months ahead. They plan days. Not because they expect victory, but because they expect collapse. Quiet adjustments begin to appear. Orders are interpreted more loosely. Withdrawals are delayed just long enough to avoid attention, but not long enough to be catastrophic. Paper trails grow thinner. Responsibility is pushed downward, or sideways, not to escape guilt, but to survive what comes next. A few generals begin thinking beyond the war, not in hopeful terms, in legal ones. What will be remembered? What can be documented? What orders were written, and which were verbal? These are not thoughts of men expecting triumph. They are thoughts of men expecting judgment. Others focus on preservation, not of territory, but of people. They try to keep units intact. They delay pointless counterattacks. They surrender when chaos makes resistance meaningless. These actions are not coordinated. They are individual, and they are dangerous. There is no formal shift, no announcement. Just a growing sense that the war has moved beyond command, that it is now an unstoppable process, moving toward an unavoidable conclusion. Some generals attempt to distance themselves from the system, quietly. They emphasize professionalism over ideology. They frame decisions as military necessity rather than belief. They prepare explanations, not for superiors, but for history. Others do the opposite. They cling to obedience, not because they believe, but because obedience feels like protection. If the system collapses, they want to say they followed orders. This is the final division inside the high command, not between optimists and pessimists, but between those preparing for responsibility and those hiding behind procedure. Neither path changes the outcome. Germany's defeat is no longer a possibility. It is a schedule. As the Allies close in, decisions become smaller and consequences larger. A bridge blown too early. A unit surrendered too late. A city defended for symbolism alone. Each choice adds weight to the ending. By April 1945, most generals know the war will end within weeks. What they do not know is how. And in that uncertainty, fear returns, not of the enemy, but of what follows silence. In the final section, we confront the hardest truth of all. Not about Germany, not about its generals, but about war itself, and why it so often continues long after it is lost. Wars do not end when they are lost. They end when the structures that sustain them fail. Germany's war did not continue because its generals believed in victory. It continued because admitting defeat was more dangerous than prolonging destruction. For the system, the lie was essential. As long as victory remained possible, even in language, authority remained intact. Orders could be issued. Obedience could be demanded. Responsibility could be deferred. The moment the lie collapsed, everything else would follow. For the generals, maintaining the lie was not always belief. Often it was survival. To speak honestly was to step outside protection. To obey was to remain inside the system, even as it burned. This is the tragedy at the heart of the story. The generals knew. The soldiers sensed it. The civilians lived it. But the system could not acknowledge it. So the war continued. Not for conquest, not for strategy, not even for hope, but because ending it required truth. And truth was forbidden. When the war finally ends in 1945, it does not feel like a decision. It feels like collapse. Orders stop arriving. Authority evaporates. Silence replaces command. Only then does the truth emerge openly, not as revelation, but as confirmation of what had been known for years. The day German generals knew the war was over was not the day it ended. It was the day the war changed its purpose, from victory to endurance, from strategy to delay, from belief to silence. That is why this story matters, because it reminds us of something deeply human. Wars are not sustained by certainty. They are sustained by fear of what comes after certainty is admitted. And when that fear outweighs reason, wars do not end when they are lost. They end when there is nothing left to command.